And Ken, why don't you go ahead? Some intros.
Hey, everybody. I'm Ken Rother. I'm one of the folks who helps, and I'm out of Ithaca at Cornell and Rev Ithaca, our incubator downtown. We've been partnered with the folks up at NextCore for 4 years on the Scale for ClimateTech program, helping folks get ready for manufacturing. And today I have the distinct honor of getting to introduce Craig Dunham. So if you check out Craig's LinkedIn, it's like incredible. First and foremost, Cornell, go Red, which is always nice. A career that spanned, Corning, publicly listed startups. And what Craig's going to talk about today around process, one of the things we teach in entrepreneurship is a startup aims to become a company. And one of the ways a startup becomes a company is when things become repeatable. For years, usually, could be 6 months, but could be 5 years. Startups, everything sort of is hard. Everything is unique. Everything is different. It's not repeatable. And you need to get to that stage of repeatability if you have any hope of scaling over time. So in order to repeat, in order to get to that scale, you need process. You can't just count on everyone knowing everything. So we have a chance today to hear from someone who's done this for big companies and small, and the idea of implementing process is so important. So I'm going to let Craig introduce himself properly, but I'm thrilled to be able to attend with all of you today and hear from Craig.
Hey, thanks, Ken. Really appreciate you, tying in the importance of this, because I truly believe that really for any company, it's important to be managing their processes. So anyway, good morning, and welcome to our discussion about process discipline and how that can help with scale up and effective manufacturing, as well as other things. So as Ken mentioned, I worked for Corning for 20 years. Most of that was in manufacturing, some in process engineering, and then later on a variety of other jobs, but spent a lot of time in doing anything from the frontline supervisor to a plant manager, and then moved on to some smaller companies for around 15 years. My last 2 roles were as a CEO in a couple of smaller companies. I've been a NYSERDA EIR for 7 years, and I've really enjoyed being part of the Scale for ClimateTech program as a mentor for Tech and Optimus Technologies. So with that, the last thing I wanted to say was I kind of look at it like I made a career in managing processes, whether I was a frontline supervisor or a CEO, which I don't know if that's a unique perspective, but I kind of look at it that way. So let's go on here. I'll share my screen and get started with the agenda. Seems like it always, there we go. Okay. So we're going to cover this in 2 parts. The first part is an overview, what is process discipline? Why is it important? And then we'll take a stop for any questions there may be, and then move on to key components of process discipline. And then wrap up with a suggested approach and a summary slide. So starting with an overview. My first experience with process discipline was a recent Cornell graduate showing up as a frontline supervisor in a manufacturing plant making catalytic converters for automobiles. And at the time, the Clean Air Act was fairly new at that time. We're talking late 70s, early 80s. And the product was a ceramic product for the catalytic converter that had 400 holes in the square inch. And the plant was having trouble making that new product in the quantities required by the automotive companies. And of course, it's not too popular to have a hole in the exhaust system. So a lot of pressure on that. So after kind of battling that problem for 2 years as a frontline supervisor, I must have complained too much because they put me into process engineering with the responsibility to stabilize the process and get the yields up, because we're still struggling with keeping up with demand. And what we ended up working on there was running a few experiments to prove that we could expand our operating conditions, and then coming up with setup sheets for each one of our products in terms of the speeds and the temperatures and how to run it. Came up with a way to make sure we're running by those procedures. Each morning I would come into a production meeting and have to report on how things went in the last 24 hours in terms of compliance to those new procedures. And eventually we created new habits and really ended up with a much higher yields and a much more comfortable position in terms of supplying our customers. So how does this fit into MRL? It fits directly into the process and the quality management categories. But I would argue that it fits into every category, because if you aren't disciplined in how you run your processes, none of these categories work. So to define process discipline, first of all, what's a process? Series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. Now that's a pretty broad definition, and that covers anything from manufacturing something to perhaps taking a customer order to doing corrective action if there is a problem that occurs. And then disciplined, which is a controlled form of behavior or way of working. So you put that all together, and process discipline is adherence to well thought out, well-defined processes that are executed on a consistent basis. How is it accomplished? Agree on the best known method, write it down and use it. So I'm going to go through each one of those a little more slowly because the words are carefully chosen. Agree on the best known method. So agree means that all the people involved in the process should be involved in establishing that best known method, at least have a chance to review it. Best known means it's not necessarily the perfect method, the ideal method, but it's the best you know at the time. Writing it down, a lot of people say, well, I can remember stuff, but there's a proverb that says the palest ink is better than the best memory. And I had a childhood story about this one. My mother always made a maple frosting on angel food cake for birthdays for myself and my 3 brothers. And for years it went great. And then she never wrote it down. And then at some point she forgot how to do it. It still tasted good, but she couldn't get the consistency right. So it would not stick to the side of the cake. It would just fall off. Now, my brothers and I, we all got a lot of laughs out of that. I'm not sure she thought it was too funny, but it kind of a silly example of the importance of writing things down. And then finally using it. If you don't use it, it's worthless. So it should be the source for training and for consistent follow-up and reinforcement. So examples of what we're talking about here would be work instructions or bill of materials. Had a friend who tells a story of walking into a plant as the new plant manager and finding 500 people looking up the back end of a horse, seeing what was going to dump on him next. And he said they had the best pooper scooper squad you ever saw. People would rush around and they clean up the mess in no time. And he said his challenge was really convincing people they should spend their time managing the process rather than cleaning up the mess. That they should work on controlling inputs like what they feed the horse, the training for the horse, the exercising the horse, and hopefully you'd get consistent outputs like race winnings. And again, to spend the time on front end of the horse activities like managing the processes, preventing problems, running to targets, reduce variation, and not so much on the back end where you're firefighting, constantly reacting, and often end up with disappointed customers. So here's an example from my experience. And this time I was the operations manager for a glass tubing plant that had lost money for many years and was faced with closure because of that. And largely what we worked on was implementing process discipline. So we met with each of the teams, making the various products in line, and we talked to them about what's important in terms of controlling your processes. And we ended up from that creating a setup sheet that defined the temperatures and the pressures where to run the process, as well as some key procedures. And it made a difference very quickly in terms of having better performance, more consistent performance. And then over time, we ended up pretty much documenting the full process, getting ISO 9000 certified. But a lot of that was kind of icing on the cake, because we had really, with our early work, we'd been able to save the plant from closure and make it one of the more profitable plants in the company at the time. Another example, at the time here, I was the CEO of a Photonics company that was doing acquisitions. And each time we did an acquisition, we'd meet with the management team and say, so where are the biggest opportunities that you have? And in this case, they said, well, we have on our biggest product, we have low yields, and that results in cost issues, as well as it's very hard to make the right number of pieces to ship to our customers. So we're often falling short when the yields are lower than we expect. So in this case, they were starting 3 parts to get 1 good one, about 30% yield. And again, it was meeting with the team and saying, what is it that's important in this process? This was a replication process where they would create a master and then make copies of it. And it turned out that a lot of the losses were because of problems, defects in the master, which then get copied into the product. So in this case, we worked a lot on work instructions. How do we create a good master? How do we protect the master from damage? And we set a goal to get up to 50% over the course of a year. And that's what we did, as you can see from this chart. So we're starting two pieces to get 1 good one, which is not so good, but it still was a dramatic improvement over where they had been. So why is process discipline the cornerstone of MRL? Because without the ability to systematically put things in place, improvements aren't sustained, and we can lose as fast as we gain. And why do I think you should implement process discipline? Why should you go after what we're talking about today? Because it's been proven to work for accelerating scale up, improving quality, reducing cost, improving delivery and customer service, and also importantly, improving the quality of work life. It's a real hassle to be fighting with the same problems day after day. So it's really a tool to continuously improve and to keep improvements in place. So why should startups care? Well, even if you're delivering prototypes, customers still expect consistency. A lot of times startups only have a few people, and if a key person leaves and nothing's written down, it can be a disaster. And it will help to reduce upsets, and it's really critical for manufacturing scale up. Keys to get it started: keep it simple and value added. I really always encourage teams to look at what's most important and work on that. Prioritize where to start. The Pareto principle applies here, that 80% of the impact comes from 20% of what you do. And a lot of times it's overwhelming if you think about trying to document everything and implement it. So I encourage people to start with what you feel is most important and then go out and implement that. One of the companies I've been working with and scale for ClimateTech is ClimateTech. And when we worked on this with them, they identified the pouring of epoxy into their device as a key step, because they have a high voltage device that's used on a substation. And if the epoxy is not poured properly, it'll break down. And they only had one person that at the time was able to do it effectively. So what they did is that they created a format, and they started to document the steps in pouring the epoxy, put some pictures in there. And, that's going to be a huge help for them as they get to the point where they scale up and they get more people involved in doing that process. So keys for using it, all the people involved in the process need to be involved in this in terms of agreeing on the best known method and getting that written down and then consistently using it. So it really comes down to a lot of attention to detail and follow-up. I grew up in Vermont. I'm a Patriots fan, and I'm pretty sure that the beginning of the season, Bill Belichick doesn't say to his team, well, we worked on blocking and tackling last year, so we're not going to bother to work on it this year. It's one of those things that takes constant attention in order to, and practice, really, to keep it in place. And that only happens if leadership is supporting it in terms of championing this and really reinforcing its use. And with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions about the overview aspect of this.
So Tom Davison here, just a question. Have you found this in your experience easier or more difficult to do at startups versus large organizations? I'm just curious what the difference is between how this relates to scale of an organization.
I think it's a mixed bag in that with startups, you're dealing with a smaller number of people. And so in some ways it's easier to influence the change. Although a lot of times you have very creative people, and this is not intended to overly constrain them, but obviously it does create some constraints if you put procedures in place and expect consistency and to have changes made in a controlled way. So, with large organizations, often the problem is that you got a lot of people that you got to convince. And, my experience has been that to some extent, leadership has to say to people that we believe this is important. We believe that if you use this, you'll find that it works for you. But right now, we need you to have faith to do it because it's an expectation that everybody's going to do it in order to make it work. So, yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. Any other questions? I know, Peter, if anything's come in.
Craig, nothing has come in through chat.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we will keep on trucking. Okay, so we're going to shift to speak about some of the key components of process discipline, get a little bit more into the details of what I'm talking about. So these are the tools that I'm going to cover. I'm going to spend the most time talking about process documentation because that's kind of the heart of it. But once you have that, you need the training and follow-up. Suppliers and materials management is an area that encourage startups to get involved in early on in terms of developing processes. We'll talk about change control, run planning, corrective action, and a little bit about communications. So the different aspects of process documentation that we're going to touch on here: work instructions, and which some companies refer to as standard operating procedures. Setup sheets, which are kind of a form of a work instruction. They tend to be more numerical, more product specific oriented. Of course, bill of materials fits into this. We'll touch on the quality manual, and then we'll get to our baking exercise. So work instructions and standard operating procedures, they're really foundational for effective processes. So encourage you to develop a format, get your subject matter experts to write it and your team to be involved in the review of it. And that you prioritize areas of greatest impact, like I talked about in the StoryTech example. Now, often these would be a bill of materials as a key area to get started, kind of like the recipe, what goes into a product. The other area which I often find to be vitally important is final inspection procedures. Up until the point where you have your processes really under control, it's important that you contain any problems within your within your organization, you don't ship the problem to your customer. So that's where final inspection procedures come in. And really important to keep it simple. Otherwise, it just becomes overwhelming and burdensome. Okay, so for those scouts out there or knot tires, here's an example of a work instruction. So tying a square knot, you got left over right, right over left, and you pull it tight. Pretty simple. You can tell if it's right because you can see how the loops slip in and out like that. Now, most processes are a little bit more complicated than a square knot, but here's a example of a format, and this format is one of the ones that's available to you following this session. So, starting out with what's this about? In this case, it's assembling a widget. It's good to mention upfront any hazards to be aware of before getting started, and then the work instructions. So in this case, getting the parts together. Bill of materials would probably be a useful thing that helps with that. Check that the parts fit, and then put in the epoxy. In this case, having a picture of what that epoxy looks like could be helpful. Cure it in an oven, and then allow it to cool and inspect. So, whatever your instructions are would go in that section. There should be some mechanism for approvals. It doesn't have to be in the same document, although I think when you're getting started, it's helpful to have it in the same document to simplify things, and you don't have to create another system to keep track of it. Same thing with history revisions. Doesn't have to be in the same document, but somewhere there should be a record of the changes that are made over time. And it's useful for people if they haven't done a procedure in a while, they can see if there's been changes since the last time by looking at the revision log. So in this case, I've included it in the same document, and I think that's, for me, it's a good way to start. So a setup sheet is a form of a work instruction. It just tends to be more numerical and more product specific. Setup sheets are things like temperatures and speeds and pressures. Typically quite a lot of numbers, maybe some brief instructions, not a ton of words, although pictures can still be helpful here. In a lot of cases, I've seen companies start with just setup sheets and no detailed work instructions. If you're running something by the numbers, such as temperatures, it's important to have a way to check periodically that the temperature is actually being measured in an accurate fashion. So here's an example of a setup sheet for our widget assembly. Setting the temperature at 350 degrees, having control over the pressure, 3 hours cycle time, where do you put the part? So amazingly, something as simple as this can actually make a very big difference in processes, especially if you're running multiple products where it's important to keep track of the various conditions required to effectively manufacture the different products. So another form of process documentation is a bill of materials. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this has been covered in the Scale for ClimateTech training. This is a template developed by Brian Hilton. But basically, this is like a recipe of the ingredients that go in, where you're listing the various parts, how many of them, often where they're sourced from. And so it's a key process document, and often one of the earliest process documents that an emerging company would want to have. I just wanted to talk just for a minute about quality manuals and quality systems. So for me, full quality system certification such as ISO 9000 is kind of an overwhelming task for a young company, and it's overkill unless it's required by customers. If you're supplying like the auto industry, you may have no choice but to do a quality system certification in order to be able to sell. Or in some cases, I've seen it used effectively as a goal, as a way to get the organization behind doing process discipline and really structuring their organization. But in any case, what we're talking about today sets the stage for future certification. The process discipline is really the fundamental basis of the quality systems. And of course, if you aren't consistent about applying your processes, your quality system is not going to effectively function. Okay, so we're to an exercise here of process documentation. So it's the work instruction, how do you bake brownies or a cake? I like to start by asking if anyone's ever had a bad experience when you didn't follow the recipe while you're baking. Anybody got anything that you'd like to share about that?
I can actually share something. This is Jackie. I recently made an apple bread over the weekend, which I have made before, but I haven't made it in quite a long time. And although I followed the recipe, I did not bake it long enough. And so I went by the instructions, but didn't use my intuition to say it was done. And I took it out of the oven and let it cool. And all of a sudden it just got this big concave in the middle. And I had this big glop in the middle of my bread.
Thank you, Jackie. My significant other is a very good cook, but she doesn't like to follow directions. So when it comes to baking, I do it because we've had some, as you pointed out, some collapsing baking that's occurred when she's tried to do it without following the recipe.
Correct, Greg. This is John Herbal. I have an example. I had a clam bake this past summer and tried to follow the instructions. And of course, clam bakes have lots of different ingredients and you have to cook them each at a different temperature and for a different amount of time. So I didn't do it very well. And the consequence is that the clams didn't cook as quickly as the other contents. And so my guests got pretty impatient and hungry along the way because I didn't serve the clams in time with the other contents. So big problem.
Thanks, John. I know a lot of people like their clams up front in the clam bake.
I'll remember that the next time.
Okay. I don't know if anybody, we had some optional pre-work we sent. I don't know if anybody wants to share a recipe at this point. Not necessary, but if there's anybody that'd like to share.
I'm Daniel from Folia. I could share mine.
Okay. And hopefully you can just share your screen. I don't know if you can do that.
Oh,
or
no,
just talk, or just talk to it.
I wrote it by
Whatever.
hands.
Yeah. Okay.
I had to procure the mix, milk, eggs, bowl, beater, spatula, and a working oven. I didn't remember until the end to include softened butter, a tray, a timer, and oven mitts. So the actual baking part, forgot about that. But yeah, preheat oven to 350, open mix box and inner liner. Pour the mix, milk, eggs into bowl, beat them up, coat the tray with butter, pour into the tray, bake for 20, use mitts to remove from oven.
Sounds good. Appreciate you sharing. I think the only thing I'd add is to make sure you reference the number of eggs and, you know, the various quantities from the box.
It is a process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, you know, kind of a silly little exercise. And, you know, what I hope that people learn from this is that even with something that seems almost trivial, like tying a square knot or, you know, baking brownies, following the recipe or having a process documentation is important. Anything else anybody wants to add before I continue on here? Okay. Let's see. Now let me advance. Any suggestions, Jackie? If it doesn't want to let me advance my, there it goes.
There you
Okay.
go.
It just had to think about it for a second. Yes. Okay, so once you've got your process documentation, it's basically worthless if you don't use it. So it should be the basis for training and for reinforcement. Formal audits and compliance are helpful. When I talk about formal audits, basically coming up with a checklist of things to check in terms of whether procedures being followed, and having someone go out and go through that checklist, observe what's going on and make sure it's being followed. I would say that informal audits are a necessity. And anytime that management is out, they should be reinforcing the use of process documentation and having an eye out for whether it is being used. And that certainly requires having a pretty good knowledge of what's there in order to do that. The key problem with process discipline is that it takes ongoing reinforcement. It will slowly fade away without that ongoing reinforcement. It's not one of those things that you put in place once, it stays there forever. I have some friends who say that they've fixed process discipline 3 or 4 times in the same organization, which is frustrating. But unfortunately, if you don't keep the reinforcement in place, things will wander and you lose control, and bad things happen. So one of the areas that encourage startup companies to consider for an area to start with process discipline is supplier management, because often most of the manufacturing is outsourced. And if the incoming materials and the contract manufacturers are not under control, then the performance of the company will be impacted. So one of the key parts of that is to make sure that there are documented requirements, a specification or other document requirements for what your suppliers are expected to deliver. And really encourage the establishment of feedback procedures. We're going to talk in a few minutes here about a corrective action form. And that is a really good way to use as a feedback procedure for your suppliers. So just a few words in terms of working with contract manufacturers and process discipline. I believe it's critical for companies to own their processes, even if they're using a contract manufacturer. This helps protect critical intellectual property, and it helps to retain the ability to change contract manufacturers. If you have a contract manufacturer who's not performing well and you have no knowledge of the process, you're in a pretty desperate position in terms of trying to make a change. And what that means is that when you get started with contract manufacturer, one of the things that you should start with is process documentation. Make it clear that it is intellectual property of your company, and set the stage right up front that the process is yours. Now, when selecting contract manufacturers, very critical to pick ones with good manufacturing systems who operate with process discipline. There are supplier management procedures that are available as part of this this webinar. There's a short procedure for supplier management, and it has 2 different supplier evaluation forms that come with that. So I touched a bit on change control, but it's important that changes made to processes in an organized fashion. Now, change is important in terms of continuing to improve. It just needs to be done in an organized way. And I know sometimes this seems constraining, and hopefully it can be done in a way that's not too burdensome. But it is important from the standpoint of making sure that changes are well thought through, that they're communicated, any retraining is done. A good goal for the long term is to have all changes based on data or experimental results. So here's a simple change control form that's available to you to use. Starting out with what's the document being changed, what type of change is it, permanent, temporary, emergency, when's it effective, and then what's the change to be made. And very importantly, what's the reason for the change and the basis for the change? And there should be some mechanism for approving these changes. You know, it might be just one sign off, but there should be some mechanism for it. Run plan, run review. I'm just going to touch on that very briefly, is a really important step for continuous improvement. What this really comes down to is, before you run a product, having your group sit down and talk about it. This is a good time perhaps to do some initial process documentation that can be used in that run. And then after the run is completed, sit down again and talk about what happened. And again, this is an opportunity to say, are there changes we should be making to the process documentation, or are there new things that we learned that we should document? So it's really part of continuous improvement. It's just, and it's important to use your systems as you're doing this, so that you're making changes and improvements, and you're doing it in a controlled fashion. Corrective action. Another part of another system that I would encourage companies to get involved in fairly early on, to have a simple corrective action form. We'll see one here in a minute. And in particular, to use this with suppliers, to put a little bit more formality into dealing with problems. But it also is a powerful tool to use internally to help to find root causes and to put fixes in place. So here's another form that's available to you, starting with a description of the problem, you know, what happened, what went wrong, and then taking the time to identify what's the root cause and what's the action plan that's going to be taken to make sure this problem doesn't occur again. There should be some approvals in terms of this corrective action form, and also encourage a sign off to say that the things have been implemented and put in place. So finally, I had to throw communications in there. Often with early manufacturing, there's one person that does all the work, or there's single experts that do each step of the process. But as things scale up, that changes and you have more people involved. And good communications are needed. And one of the things that I found to be a really important tool, really helpful tool in terms of scaling up, is to have a few measures where you're putting out a measure and display. To pick a few goals, you know, somewhere to, you know, 3 to 5 that are posted in your some shared space. So you saw this example earlier from a process yield. So in this case, we had identified a goal to get to 50% over the course of the first year, and that we're going to measure this quarterly. Often it's useful to measure it on a monthly or even a weekly or possibly daily basis. Just we chose to do it quarterly. So each quarter we would put a new bar on the chart. This was posted in the break room for everybody to see. And we also had some monthly discussions where we would talk about how we're doing on this. Okay, so just a couple slides left. One on suggested approach, and that is to start by reviewing what you're currently doing and identify your key needs. Suggest writing a few high impact work instructions or setup sheets or bombs. One of those might be a final inspection process to help contain any problems. And as soon as you have that done, implement it. Train, implement, reinforce. Don't wait till you've documented everything in the process. Pick some high impact areas and get started with it. And that helps in terms of making this process more bite-sized. And also, as you start to get that in place, normally there's some benefits that you see, and that helps as you expand documentation. Continue to keep it simple and value added. So in summary, process discipline is foundational to effective scale up and MRL advancement. I really encourage you to start now, keeping it simple and value added and building over time. For each of your processes, what it involves is agreeing on the best known method, writing it down, and then following it. And it does require consistent use and reinforcement, or it won't work, or it'll fade away over time. And that really comes down to leadership championing this to make it happen. Okay, that's it. So are there any further questions?
So this is Tom Davison again. I put this in the chat, but I'll just ask directly. When you're selecting a contract manufacturer, how important is it that they are ISO certified?
Well, the advantage of that is that you know that if they're ISO certified, they at least know what to do. Now, unfortunately, there's plenty of companies that have a piece of paper and don't actually run their processes in a disciplined fashion. So I think that it is a good step because it shows that they put the effort into it. But I still think that you got to be careful. And as far as I'm concerned, ISO certification is not critical, but process discipline is. So if they're not ISO certified, then it means that got to be a little more careful about whether they really are operating their processes in a consistent way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Because a lot of the things you talk about with, control of a process, and what is it, the old for ISO, it's say what you do and then do what you say, right? That's
Right.
kind of the sort of the old saw that goes with it. And but you're right. I mean, they may have the piece of paper. Question is, are they actually doing it? So I think even if they're ISO certified, you want to go and definitely check that out just to verify that you're seeing that level,
Right.
that level of discipline and process, and in the other factors of ISO as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the forms that's included with the supplier management procedure is for basically going in and asking some questions. You're saying, can you show me your process document?
Exactly.
And ask them to pull it out, and then you say you can ask some questions of operators.
Yeah.
So
Are there yield charts up to date? Right.
Yeah. So you get a sense pretty quickly whether they do run their process in a disciplined fashion.
Exactly.
But I do think that ISO is a good indicator, and particularly if you don't have experienced people that can go in and make those assessments, then ISO is a good thing to look for, because at least it means they know what they're supposed to be doing.
Yep. First step.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure people would disagree with me about my position in terms of ISO. So, that's just my view in terms of.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's certainly if they do have certification, and if they are really, really doing it, that's, to me, that's really solid. But you're right. You definitely have to make sure that they're actually performing that way.
Some of the companies I've been involved with, we've chose not to do ISO, but we've chosen to do process discipline because ISO had some baggage that was unwieldy and was unnecessary.
Yeah,
but
for sure. So
we didn't need the piece, we didn't need the certificate.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So this is Ken. I have a question, actually. I have a question about internal expertise. When do you use an outsider? At what size or complexity or processes do you need your internal person? Sort of, how should someone think about, just like any other function, whether it's accounting or HR or core engineering, like sort of the build versus buy, or outsource versus do it yourself. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, my view on this is that you may need an outside person to help you with some structure, which is the kind of thing that I've done with the mentoring with companies, but that the work itself has to be done by the internal people. You can hire a document writer, but I personally don't think that's the most effective approach. I think it's much better to keep it very simple and have the people that are doing the work write it.
Got it.
because you need the ownership.
Yeah.
Without the ownership, it doesn't go anywhere.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Greg, we have a question from someone in chat. Sierra would like to know, is there a format or medium you recommend to document and store the work instructions and checklists? Something like Word or Excel?
Well, as you'll see, I mean, that's the documents that I know there's systems out there, and I have to say that I'm not an expert on those. When you're getting started, I think just using something like Word, Excel, or I think the shared docs, Google shared docs is a good way, although you got to make sure that you have some control over the changes, which is what I don't like about those, is that anybody can change it, and there's just it's hard to control it. But I'm sure there's systems out there, but I'm not the right person to help you with it. I think when you're getting started, I just would keep it simple though. You know, use whatever you use within your company. And then as you start to get enough of these that you need something more formal and organized, then you do a survey of what's available.
Thank you.
Often people got to have a computer system to do anything, and you get stuck trying to find the computer system. You don't get around to the important work. But again, that's one of my biases. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that in relation to that last bit of conversation, and particularly regarding process documentation and the storing, etc. The key thing, in my view, is the availability. Make sure they're available to the people that have them. They're no good being stored upstairs in the office, or you have to walk to the bottom end of the factory to look up people should be familiar with them and have access to them. And you've already mentioned, to keep them simple and friendly. A lot of stuff can be referenced out, like bill of materials and so on as well, just to keep the volume and size down on them. On the earlier conversation about ISO, I don't know, is there a reputable contract manufacturer who doesn't have ISO? Is they exclusively able to supply people who aren't interested in having ISO certification? My experience is that ISO's been running for quite a long time. It's evolved, and I would say that at the moment it's built on common sense and good business practices. And I would encourage businesses that are in a startup phase, when they're developing their systems, to take account of future ISO requirements and try to align them so that in some time in the future they have a degree of alignment. They don't have to reinvent a lot of stuff over again. And as I say, a lot of us, I mean, ISO's got things in it like continuous improvement and corrective actions. There's a lot of built-in checks and balances. The key thing I would suggest to avoid in writing documentation is not to say anything about inspection. You can't inspect in quality. You can use audits and so on. And Craig's already mentioned the importance of audits and to make sure that you get in compliance. The old adage that, now in my experience way back when we were doing more shop floor things, was that it's important that people are compliant. And if you can't change the people, then you have to change the people. And sometimes that's the only way to get that to work. So that's all the main things. Just in byword, there's a lot of people been doing this, people like Deming and Duran, who are working on this for quite a long time. And there's a lot of tools in there to assist people in getting the processes right. But as Craig has pointed out here and emphasized, it's really, really important to have some record of what the process actually is and to keep it up to date. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Just make a start. Something's better than nothing. And then you can build on that. And sorry, talking too much here, but just to finish off, getting somebody in to write processes for you is the old definition of what a consultant is. And that's getting somebody to come in to tell you something that you already know. So,
well, thanks for those comments. And I really agree with pretty much everything you said. A couple of things they wanted to just say was, I would agree that most contract manufacturers can be ISO certified, but if you're buying parts from a supplier there's still plenty of suppliers out there that aren't ISO certified that are still good suppliers, and of course, plenty that aren't. So it's more likely if you're buying a component that you're dealing with someone that's not ISO certified. The other thing is that while I would agree that 100% inspection is something that over time you'd like to get away from, I think when you're starting up, you kind of have to do 100% inspection because you want to contain a problem. You want to make sure that what you send to your customer is good. And that often means that you need 100% inspection in order to be able to do that.
Greg, we have one more question in the chat from Sharad.
Okay.
He said, given recent supply chain shortages, you often have to change parts. You'd like to know if that part change when you change the documentation to correspond with it, is that a permanent change or a temporary change?
Well, it depends on what your intentions are, but what you might often do is you might create an additional supplier would be a permanent change. But if you really do intend to return, then it could be a temporary change. And just, I think that take the opportunity. That's a really good example of a case where having good documentation can really save you, because if you have clear specifications for a product and you can't get it anymore, your chances of being able to be successfully changed someplace else are greatly enhanced by that versus not having that stuff written down.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of my more follow-up question there was like, when do you drop the line between versioning of documentation of products where, things are changed? Because like I have to constantly keep switching every quarter, and it's just, I don't know when that will come down. Sometimes it's little things, doesn't really matter, but other things, sometimes I have to go in and actually find a alternative part that doesn't necessarily complies with all of my specifications, but I have to use what I have and what's available and not delay the project. So it's sort of a battle where I'm trying to figure out whether I should make another version or whether I should do a temporary change, knowing that my primary supplier would be giving stock in the next, 30 or 6 months or something like that. So it's like I've created a lot of documentation, but then to make every little change every single, month or whatever, it definitely is a bit tedious. So I'm just trying to figure out a way that maybe you might have an idea on to make it a little bit easier.
Well, a couple things on that. First of all, I would say that if you're having to waive requirements that you feel are important, then you should make it a temporary change with the idea that you can return to the more stringent requirements once the situation changes. I mean, you got to be practical about this. You got to keep running. So, things like that happen. And in terms of revisions, I mean, the revisions need to occur as you make changes to the process. So I know that can be burdensome, particularly if you're making a lot of changes. But if you only do it, on a monthly basis or something, then you don't have accurate information out there on the floor. Something I mentioned from I think Willie's comments is I agree with him that you need the documentation available, and I know paper is sort of frowned upon these days, but that may still be the best the best form to have it out there. I mean, if they can have access through a computer, that's fine. It just needs to be really easy. If it's hard to get to documentation, it won't get used. So paper may still be the best solution, at least in the early days.
And we have one last question. Peter, you want to go ahead, and then we can start thinking about wrapping up.
Okay.
Sure thing. This is from Ronald. He wants to know, should the rejection reports and corrective action documentation start from first articles or after the first articles are approved?
I would start, personally, I would start early. That's what I would do. But I mean, I don't know what you have to understand the situation a bit, but I don't think you can start too early on it's a thought process. And writing it down doesn't take that much longer than it does to think the right way. So using the form helps you to think in a way that is useful, get to the root cause and fix it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for your participation. Hope it was helpful.
Thank you, everybody. Craig, thanks. That was a great session.
Everybody.
And we will be sharing the recording link with everyone later this week.
Okay, thanks and bye-bye.